Any questions? Councilmember O'Donnell.
Yes, Dale, thanks for presenting this to us today. In regards to the taxation talking point that you brought up, where it talks about the council opposing legislative attempts to restrict taxing and spending authority of local governments, I think this is the one that this has to do with valuations, right, that you're talking about here.
That is one current idea. There may be others as well.
Right, but the one that has the most legs and the most potential would be the one where local governments would have to raise the mill levy. They would have to take a vote if values go down on houses or if they go up on houses. It would change it. Is that what you're referring to with this?
That is one of those that we've discussed with legislators. We expect that to be introduced, and that will be an issue, yes.
Right. Because obviously, and not just that I'm heading to the legislature, but from this position, I've always advocated. I believe that local governments, not just Wichita or Sedgwick County, but all across state, they talk about not raising their mill levy for 30 years, 20 years, 18 years, when really home values continue to go up. And if you look over the last 15 years, people are paying twice what they were paying for property taxes. And it may be a shorter time period than the last 15 years. But you hear your not your legislators, you hear your council members and commissioners going around saying, hey, we haven't raised our mill levy. Well, you're still paying more in property taxes. So to me, what the bill in Topeka would try to do is make people really stand on rhetoric that we haven't raised your taxes. Well, your taxes have still gone up. So regardless or not of me going to Topeka, I've always been one to promote keeping taxes low, fixing it, and if your taxes are going to go up on the house, we need to be honest with people and say, well, you are paying more in taxes instead of we haven't raised your taxes in, X number of years. And my other issue.
Mayor, if I could respond to that issue, we met with Representative Brunk last week, who is the sponsor of that bill, and I thought we had a really good conversation with him. The issue that he brings up is somewhat similar, but he talks about the increase in property taxes exceeding CPI over a period of time. And what we did is we broke it out by components, because the issue that is addressed in the bill is taxation that is related to growth in existing base, not from new construction or annexation or change in land use, but from existing base. And what we found is if you go back to, I think it was 2001, through 2013, our budget period, that the increase in the valuation in base for that period of time was far less in Wichita than CPI. And it was only, I think during that entire period, the base only increased by about 7.5% roughly, where CPI during that same period of time was in over 30%, if I remember the numbers correctly. So what we did is we talked to him about putting a CPI trigger in as part of his bill, and I think he's receptive to that. Again, talking about that's the complaint he hears the most is the increase in existing base growth, or the taxation on existing base that exceeds that CPI. So I think it's moving in a direction that may be a little more acceptable, and I think our concern was that the bill originally was a one-size-fits-all, and I think we would agree that there are communities in the state that probably have been on automatic pilot, as you indicated, but that's not been the case here. And I just wanted to make sure that we were dealing with the reality of the situation in Wichita as we talked to Representative Brunk and other legislators going forward. So that's, I think, going to be our position going forward, that we're going to see, that we're asking for a modification of that bill, recognizing that there'll be some legislation considered this session.
I would just add the outcome that the city and the county are working together to draft alternative that addresses those concerns. Representative Brunk is willing to look at that. So it's a good process that started, and we're hopeful for a productive outcome.
Thank you.
Councilman Meitzner.
Yes, on that issue, I appreciate you having a meeting with Mr. Brunk, and then Michael, your interest as well. I'm I'm a little concerned to make sure the intent was not to exempting new growth. I mean, new growth can still add to the value of the city, but I want to make sure that I'm using that word, remodel or improvements to existing buildings, especially commercial, that take a building that's worth on the tax rolls at $20,000, all of a sudden it's up and running at on the tune of $100,000. That's considered part of the growth that's exempt from this, because I like the idea of the base tied to CPI or minimal. That the base, which is the typical homeowner, which is I think the intent, is that hasn't done anything to their home, and I totally agree with that's what the intent is. But I want to make sure that we're not have these unintended consequences from not only organic or outside growth, but the organic growth from improvements that are done, even residential improvements.
Right. Right now, the improvements to the property would be exempt, as would new construction. That's my understanding of the bill.
Okay.
And the rollback would only apply if the existing base exceeded CPI. That's, I believe, the way we proposed it last week.
But the bill is very, I guess, tightly written at this point. It's very short. That reference to new improvements in real estate world and property tax, that could mean a new house. It's a clarification. It's certainly not the intent of Representative Brunk, I think, to penalize in that area unjustly. So that's part of the discussion going forward, though.
I think some of the confusion is that there is a bill floating around that's not been, it's not Representative Brunk's bill, and he's getting one drafted, and that's what we were working on last week.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Councilman Longwell?
Yeah, I agree with what Bob has laid out there as a plan, and I think it's also worth mentioning that over the last 4 years or so, how long have you been with us? 4 years? That we have worked really hard in this community to reduce the cost of government. We've privatized functions where we've could. We've eliminated some management positions, and so I would argue if other government entities could follow our formula and look at what our cost of government has done over the last 4 years, the state would be in great shape. So I'm glad we've had this discussion, and I appreciate Bob taking a look at that, and want to make sure people understand we're pretty proud of what we've done in this community in terms of the cost of running services that our citizens need.